Boa noite. Eu vou falar em inglês porque me pediram para falar em inglês devido aos nossos convidados, mas não queria deixar de dizer olá em português. E there you are. Portanto, vou passar para português, para inglês. Thank you, Gaz, by the way, for this deconstruction of museum politics, but also for showing us how a potential failure can be turned into something beautiful, which I think is what is really the interesting challenge. And of course, thank you also for a presentation of how museums always embody a mission, mostly when they're public and when they are of course, representing the values of a given nation, but also when they're private. I must say that I have a very different perspective to show here, being a free agent that then went on to work with 2 private museums. So the idea of the private museum can be here an interesting or represent here an interesting contrast in regards to what we've just heard in terms of public collections, public archives, and what to do with them, and what kind of missions to embody with them. The difference with private museums, I would say, is that basically private entities can do whatever they want, and they can actually do things because they want to do them and not because they're entitled or obliged to do certain things. So the Museum of Modern Art actually is made of a board of philanthropists, collectors, real estate developers, and people who have lots of money, who love art, and therefore made it their mission, because they wanted it, to share their taste of art with other people. And so they created the Museum of Modern Art, and that continues until today as a big tradition. People may confuse it with a public institution, but I can guarantee you that it's a fully private institution in which maybe 1% of the budget comes from public endowment. That means that all the money has to be gathered and collected so as to organize all these exhibitions, maintain all the collection for which it's famous, and so on and so on. But this will lead me only into a later story. I have also a slightly different approach in bringing somewhat of a more philosophical or historical context, in the sense of doing a very fast history of how museums progressed from cabinets of curiosities, of people who really had the power to collect things and started to, put them in cabinets and in their rooms and show it them, and how suddenly then palaces turned into public spaces after the French Revolution, and you started also to encourage and show the production of artists as an expression of society with the salon, and then you come to these. Really, it's a really quick history, but I thought, this kind of image and how museums turn into this production of spectacle, I think it's really interesting. And this is maybe not what we're talking about here, because as we have heard, architecture museums are sort of specialized or niche museums, and therefore they don't attract this kind of multitudes or crowds, but still they do compete within the same arena of trying to capture attention. So through architecture itself, of course, you can engage with the city, you can engage with the idea of the museum here as a franchise with the Guggenheim, but also turning the city itself into a museum of images, but basically addressing this idea that our visual culture, or the way we consume everything through images, is so important now, and I would say that gives us also the answer to the question. Sorry, that also gives us the answer to the question that was posed here before, which was more or less, why is research through archives decreasing? And I believe it's because, of course, the internet makes images, makes information, bits of information accessible in a way that people, of course, lazily will recur to more easily than the work that it implies to go through an archive, to discover things, and so on. So I would say, also from my experience as a professor, that whatever is in the internet will be visible, will be reproduced, will be reproduced endlessly, and whatever is even in archives, it will only very slowly surface onto the eyes of the many. This is, by the way, André Malraux looking at the images with which he composed The Museum Without Walls, or the Imaginary Museum in English language. So the idea that the museum is comprised by everything. And of course, this brings us to a situation in which if you are a museum person, if you are someone who works with museums, you have to ask yourself, where do you want to go? What do you want to do? What is the role of the museum? Indeed, beyond the traditional missions that we heard described here so precisely. I think Gus did a good job dealing with, as I said, the deconstruction of those missions, dealing with ruins, dealing with neoliberal politics, dealing with new visions of culture. I would say that certainly engages with my own notions that the museum maybe doesn't have to be only, although I surely respect the mission, doesn't have to be only this archive, this idea of conservation, but I think museums can be more active players, let's say, in the social debate today, in the political debate, even if you want, in the cultural debate in a broader sense. And that's why I think maybe the museum should be more experimental. And we have seen these. I'm not saying anything new. I'm just remembering an exhibition at the V&A 1 year ago or 2 years ago about political activism and the visual expressions of political activism that very quickly, for a museum that size, engaged with questions that were evidently in the agenda of the media, of people in general. So in this sense, I have sort of defended through practice and in a way through reflection that the museum should be really an activator of the city, to go beyond its walls and to really intervene in the city, so that through programs or even through encouraging new experiments and new practices, you could actually engage with either local communities or the mass of tourists that travels around the world, but in a way activate the city beyond its own walls. But I also defended that the museum should be, as I just exemplified by the reference to the V&A, the museum could be also an activist, and in this sense, an activist that precisely uses the tools that it has, like the collection, like the archive, so as to enter the debate, the current debate. And this is what I try to do, and this is where we come into the idea of collections. For me, this is when I confronted myself for the first time with a collection, and a big one too, and a great one too, which was the Museum of Modern Art in 2012 when I came there, and what to do with that collection. And for me, it was immediately evident that besides the fact that this collection was really a playground with which you could play, you had the privilege to play with some amazing things, you could also use it to speak about the present. I mean, again, it didn't have to be just about historical relationships, about themes, about the construction of ideas or narratives of the past, but actually you could go back to it so as to make it talk about the present, and to make it enter a debate, and to make it enter a discourse that in this case was very clearly political. I mean, I had just arrived in New York when people were still echoing the Occupy Wall Street movements and asking this question, so how, as architects, can we contribute towards this movement? And for me, the immediate response or reaction was, come on, guys. I mean, intervening in the city is actually a very political act. If you do a building, if you design a bit of streets or a park, you're doing the most political act, one that has actually impact on most people. But besides the traditional idea that architecture can express politics just by representing power, just by, as you know, representing religion, representing the powers that be, there were other ways of being political. And so my idea was to dig into the collection and show the ways in which actually political activism or political intention or political ideas could sort of flourish from works that you are used to read, for instance, only from an aesthetic point of view. So for me, one of the big satisfactions of doing this show was someone coming in and saying, oh, that's really funny. I had never thought of archigram as a sort of political intervention. But of course, if you think about it, it's obvious. I mean, there were radical rethinkers of the city with its condition in the 1960s, questioning consumerism, questioning the whole model that was left by modernism, and really trying to juxtapose an ironic view but a disruptive view of what the city could be. Of course, they were fun, and they were having fun, and they wanted to have fun, but at the same time, they were extremely political. Of course, I was with Peter Cook in Shenzhen like 3 weeks ago, and he totally refused the idea that he was being political, and he hates being called political. But the question is, this doesn't mean that you don't interpret his work or the work of others as political. So I think there is a lot of interpretation and, as you said, production of knowledge, production of new interpretations out of the materials that are in the archives. And this has been done always, but I think it's very interesting to rethink that role of interpretation, not only from an art historical point of view, but also from a point of view of how these works continue to talk to people and continue to express ideas and continue to bring out ideas that we can still reuse. The idea of utopia, which we'll come back later, is one of those ideas. I mean, the only reason why we are still or are now looking so much at these materials from the 60s and 70s, radical architectures of this period, is probably because they were not realized, and therefore their potential is still there for us to revisit and to probably adapt and reinvent by using the technologies that are now available to us to transform them into something else. So I think these materials, these archives, are very important, not from an art historical point of view, but for what they can still mean and trigger in terms of inspiration when you're thinking about the current situation. And so, of course, following from that, I also would be saying that the museum should therefore be an agitator. Not only, and I think Gus also demonstrated the principle, the museum should be something that disrupts, that creates tension, that brings out new interpretations. And maybe this is where private museums, in the end, although Gus was working on a public institution, but with a very individual, I would say, mind, I think maybe this is where private museums, because they are not tied to a certain mission by obligation, although They always claim, naturally, that they also have missions. They also are helping improving culture and so on. Maybe then that's where you find a certain freedom to agitate through the activity of the museum. And I would say that uneven growth, which was about inequality in current cities, in current urban environments, was again for me very satisfying by the simple fact that if you were a museum visitor at MoMA in New York, you would be coming out of the pleasures and the comforts of Picasso and Matisse and suddenly emerge into what is a very dystopic scenario of the near future in which most of the populations of the world are poor and the inequality is increasing, and therefore people were suddenly asked to think and to react and to in a way, come out of their comfort zone in terms of what would be a very traditional entertaining mission of the museum. So this led us to the new project. Contrary to the people that, have something to report, numbers, facts and exhibitions over the last 3 years, I have nothing to present because this is just about to be done. So the only thing you can say or talk about is really intentions and how, again, you would face this idea of the museum. What kind of museum can you do? What kind of innovation can you bring into the museum realm without even being too ambitious or too arrogant? Just what can you do? What will be interesting in a certain context and in a certain moment? And I think many in Portugal will be disappointed because this is not an architecture museum. That's for sure. I mean, of course, there is a need for an architecture museum in Portugal, and the fact that architecture is mentioned there, I will explain, is also as a reason to be. But this is not the museum in which you will see monographs on architects or which you see thematic architecture exhibitions, because I think there is something else to do which may be repositioning architecture as more of a cultural production that again introduces some commentary on current situations, exactly at the same level as artists have been doing it. So here, the new interdisciplinary model that I mentioned in the title is just the fact that the idea of the main exhibitions at the MAAT will be to present artists and architects working exactly at the same intellectual level as 100 years ago they would be, not to say that before artists were depending on architecture and buildings to have their production. So to reposition the production of architects at the same level as that of artists, as producing commentary, as triggering ideas and triggering critical thought about or thinking about what is happening, this would be one of the most ambitious and at the same time modest ambitions of the MAAT. Of course, the other reason architecture is there also on the title is that this being the museum of a private foundation that has already an art collection, and so the visual arts are present by inheritance and by nature, it's also an institution that not only has one of the most important industrial buildings of Lisbon and therefore represents architecture from the point of view of industrial archaeology, but it will also have one of the most, I would say, disruptive buildings to be built in Portugal over the next years and already considering past years. So it's a building that will present for sure a very different and probably for many very complicated spatial experience. And it will be, in a way, a museum that represents the beginning of the 21st century as much as the Central Tejo represents the beginning of the 20th century at its height in connection to technology, to the available technology, and to what is possible. So in a way, because there were already two architectural gems within the conception of the museum, there is an heritage to take care, there is a collection that relates to buildings. This was obviously something to take advantage of, but also the fact that, of course, architecture in Portugal is important. And the fact that it doesn't have yet a museum or a representative space, it means that we can occupy that space to produce some statements on that cultural field of production. But basically, let's say, I wouldn't expect at all that this would prevent the need and the idea that an architecture museum still makes sense to represent all that flourishing culture that happened from the post-war era until today in Portugal in terms of modern and contemporary architecture. So this is just to explain, let's say, the intention. The art, architecture, and technology will connect probably more to the way that artists and architects reflect and represent their relationship to technology in a moment, in which, of course, technology is changing dramatically our lives and our ways of living, but in a way not strictly focusing on technology, although there is museological aspect to the Central Tejo, which connects obviously to science, technology, and energy, and the production of energy, etc., etc. What I can say here, just to give you a glimpse of what may be happening, is just to disclose some of the things that we will be doing. Maybe that explains the project a little bit more. I didn't bring all the exhibitions that we're planning for 2016, but at least I just wanted to mention that because we still have a collection that was just on the news yesterday, a collection of Portuguese art, which we want to continue and which we want for the first time to start showing. The first exhibition on that collection will be called Second Nature, is about the idea that actually nature has disappeared, and now we have only things that have been touched by man, intervened by man, and altered by man, being that artists were the first that through representation started to change nature and our conceptions of nature. So this view of the collection is one of the typical exhibitions that we'll be doing by having external curators looking at the EDP collection. And then the first installation or exhibition happening in October with the opening of the museum is a major installation, new commission from Dominique Gonzalez Forster, who is, of course, an artist that has worked on this theme that we want to explore in this anniversary of the publication of Thomas More's Utopia, Dominique Gonzalez Forster. So this is the part one of an exhibition that will focus on this theme, and that precisely, as I said earlier, will have artists, architects presenting at the same level. That will be actually the second part, in which you have just a current wish list, some of the artists that are confirmed for exhibition, but where you see the sort of range of artists and architects that we want to show in these exhibitions that in a way bridge the historical inception of certain themes that affect our current times, together with the very contemporary reflections of artists that precisely continue to discuss the same themes. I think this is what I have to say. I think the debate now can help in something more. Thank you.